Greetings and welcome back to Room 303. We are engaged in our series of conversations regarding Gibran's The Prophet. This is lecture 24 on prayer. We are in some ways back to earlier lectures like number 13, Crime and Punishment, or number 23, Good and Evil, the conversation of the divinity within, the God self that applies to all humans. And it won't shock us when we say that Gibran's going to play the game of prayer, so different from a good number of those who came before him, so similar in some ways. Al-Mustafa will be presenting Gibran's ideas on the prayer life, right? And I think that's the real way to think about it with Gibran. Now, there is a natural progression, it seems to me, from good and evil to this conversation on prayer. And for some, this is in fact their favorite poem of the entire collection of poems called The Prophet. You'll remember that in Luke 11, 1 through 4, Christ is asked, teach us how to pray. And he will say, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. We're familiar with that prayer. I think in large measure, and we've seen this a number of times already in The Prophet, Gibran likes to take these ancient sacred texts, not just from the biblical tradition, and to reinvent them in compelling ways. And I'm going to try and point that out in this conversation as well. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you've already been introduced to the comments that we are that we're calling the introductory comments. And then as well, I hope that you've been doing all the preceding reading up through and including, as we said, on good and evil. Now, there's been an argument, man, maybe as far back as St. Augustine, that the only two real prayers are help, or help me, or help us, and thank you, or a prayer of gratitude. And in some ways, prayer for Gibran is this expansive understanding in the living ether, as he will call it in this poem, that will connect all of us in some way. Gibran will, in some ways, as we said, transform some of the religious ideas of prayer into, maybe we would argue, more spiritually oriented understandings of prayer. The temple invisible, he will refer to it as. You'll notice that we don't really have a set of words about how to pray this prayer or whatever, until the very end of the poem. So there's a bit of irony there. And again, in that regards, he almost seems to be going, not in contrast to, but certainly going a little different direction from the Luke 11, 1 through 4 passage. And then, of course, finally, this won't shock us because the integral thinker that Gibran is, everything's going to be relational. It's always going to come back to community as well. And we're going to be reminded again of that passage 13, or that lecture 13, Crime and Punishment, with the God self being possessed by all of us. And this is, for Gibran, prayer is the way we know that we are connected to each other. I also want to point out, we'll comment on it here in a little bit at 3a, this amazing collection of drawings that are a part of the original publishing of The Prophet. There's an amazing one here in the middle of this poem as well. Then a priestess said, is it Altamitra? We're not told, but notice somebody who's interested in the question of prayer in the spiritual life. Then a priestess said, speak to us of prayer. And he answered, saying, you pray in your distress and in your need. That's the prayer of help, right? Would that you might pray also in the fullness of your joy and in your days of abundance. Well, there's your prayer of thanks. In other words, for Gibran, he doesn't want to see prayer as being just simply propitiatory. I need these things. Please give me these things. But rather to see prayer as the recognition in one's distress of the need for help, but also the recognition of generosity and thankfulness when, again, your days are full of joy and abundance, no question. For what is prayer? Now he'll come back to these rhetorical questions, and it is true. By the time, I mean, this is, we're going 30 lectures over this text, and now we're at lecture 24, so, you know, we're obviously to the end. And so, by this point, you begin to kind of get a feel of how to read these poems. Notice how many times we'll get into these rhetorical questions that will engage in a certain level of paradox. For what is prayer? But the expansion, there's this views on evolution, of yourself into the living ether. In other words, prayer is the manifestation of yourself into this world, the living ether, as he will refer to it. And if it is for your comfort to pour your darkness into space, It's also for your delight to pour forth the dawning of your heart. In other words, it is true that we will meet moments of tremendous sorrow. Go back to our very introductory lecture as to what motivated my set of comments for this poem, The Prophet, in the first place. Terrible pain, terrible sorrow. And it's during those times, no question, that one cannot help but call out, I need help. But what about the other side? He says the delight that has to be poured into the dawning of your heart. This idea that when we are full of joy, we are also engaged in prayer. We just often don't realize it. And if, more questions, observations, and if you cannot but weep when your soul summons you to prayer, she should spur you again and yet again, though weeping, until you shall come laughing. You'll remember that we said about the theodicy question, why do terrible things happen? We have to stop asking, why did this happen to me? And rather learn to ask, why did this happen for me? That is the prayer that's being referenced here. When you are in tremendous sorrow, you must, he says, continue to pray until the joy will come. When you pray, he says, you rise, more flight theme, to meet in the air. Again, it's always about community, right? To meet in the air those who are praying at that very hour, and whom save in prayer you may not meet. This, for me, is a fascinating idea. You'll remember that it was Plato that said, be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting their own battle. And I think Gibran is making a similar observation. We're all engaged in a process in our living of dealing with sorrow and experiencing brief moments of joy. And throughout all of that, whether the prayer is help or the prayer is thank you, there should be some sense that when we are doing that, we are somehow connected with every other single person on this planet. That's a compelling way to think about prayer. Notice, in more original views of prayer often, especially where we are making petition to the deity, there is the individual praying, and then there is, of course, whoever the deity is. In Gibran's view, prayer is what connects all of us because we all long for help, and we're all grateful in moments for the brief joys that we have in our life. He says, therefore let your visit to that temple invisible, think about the fact that he's giving this set of comments in front of a temple, be for naught but ecstasy and sweet communion. What a great phrase. There it is. And many have said sweet communion is at the heart. This is really the heart of Gibran's project. What is it that Gibran wants more than anything else? Ask him, what would be your ideal world or your ideal position? And he would say, sweet communion. The ability for everyone to commune in a sweet or graceful way. And he's going to argue that when that's happening, that's prayer. For if you should enter the temple for no other purpose than asking, you shall not receive. There's going to be 3 of these nots. Watch this. And if you should enter into it, the temple, to humble yourself, you shall not be lifted. Or even if you should enter it into the temple to beg for the good of others, you shall not be heard. Now again, all these are forms of petition prayer. It is enough, he says, that you enter the temple invisible. In other words, prayer is an attitude of living. It isn't some, words that are spoken, but rather the way you see the very existence that you get to endure at times, enjoy at other times. No question, right? We have sorrow, we have joy. He says then, sounding very much like Walt Whitman's The Speaker in Song of Myself 46, you are asking me questions, I hear you, I answer, I cannot answer, you must find out for yourself. We've given full lectures on that passage in all of the poems of Leaves of Grass at learnstrong.net in our talks with Walt. And Whitman was very influential in the life of Gibran, and I think here as well. Notice what he says, I cannot teach you how to pray in words. And again, this takes us, of course, back to the Luke 11 passage where Christ is asked, how should we teach us to pray? And he says, our Father who art in heaven. So notice he says, I can't do it. God listens not. Notice he continues with these negations. God listens not to your words, save when he himself utters them through your lips. The translinguistic view that words don't matter when it comes to prayer. I mean, I commented on help me or thank you. But the truth is, even those are not necessary, he says. And he says, I cannot teach you the prayer of the seas and the forests and the mountains, sounding very much like Spinoza, one of our great favorites in 303. The idea that we're all connected. And notice here, it's the seas, the forests, the mountains. Everything is connected. I think he also learned this from his study of Whitman. All of nature is connected. All of nature prays because all of nature exists. But you who are born of the mountains and the forest and the seas, of course I love this passage because look at where we get to live, guys, right? At the foot of the Bighorn Mountains, right? But you who are born of the mountains and the forests and the seas can find their prayer in your heart. In other words, prayer is an attitude of existing in which you're constantly praying help, either me or others, and then thank you from me and for others. And he finishes now, ironically, he starts out by saying, I can't tell you how to pray, and now he's going to give us a prayer. Watch the quotation marks that are coming. And if you but listen, this is huge for Gibran, in the stillness, key word it seems to me, of the night, you shall hear them, that is to say, the seas, the forests, the mountains. This is what they will be praying and saying in silence. Quote. Now again, this takes us back to the Luke 11, and I love the way Gibran will play this game of kind of building beyond the familiar passage as it's being read at the early part of the 20th century. Our God, notice it's not Father for him, our God who art our winged self, it is thy will in us that willeth. Now, of course, this identification, as we saw it in the passage on crime and punishment with the God self, in other words, the Buddha nature, the Christ nature, however you wish to think of it, the nature that is fundamental to who you are will begin with a recognition of a winged self, right? This idea of flight is again powerful. And it is thy will in us that willeth. The identification that when we ask or when we receive, we are recognizing the source. Continuing. It is thy desire in us that desireth. It is thy urge in us that would turn our nights, which are thine, into days, which are thine also. Both the pleasure and the pain. We cannot ask thee for aught, for thou knowest our needs before they are born in us. Thou art our need, and in giving us more of thyself, thou givest us all, in quote. In other words, there isn't any need to make request. This borrowing now heavily from the Matthew 6:8 passage, for your Father knows what you need before you ask. Again, the ability for Gibran to return to key passages in sacred texts and somehow transform them or make them again brand new. And I think this is one of the things that makes Gibran genius, is he takes things that we already know and he somehow makes them again new. You'll remember Shelley said in Defense of Poetry that this is what great poets do, and I think we can argue that using Shelley's Defense of Poetry, certainly Gibran is one of those great poets for us. Well, what are we going to say at 2a about this one in terms of messages or themes? I think he's arguing that prayer is the way we connect with ourselves, with each other, and of course with divinity, that is in fact both of those things. At 2b, I love the allusions or the referencing to sacred passages, but then reinventing them, refocusing them in some way. At 3a, well, I'd like to just go to that drawing that's in the middle for those of you who have access to the volume, and to just see that, what I have labeled that beautiful drawing of the community of prayers. The idea of the community, and if you look at that drawing, you'll see, I think, of what I'm saying, how everything is connected in that really brilliant drawing. That puts, to me, Gibran in the same league as a William Blake, who would publish To the Lamb, To the Tiger, and all the other poems of experience and innocence and experience, with those drawings that are so captivating. Go back to learnstrong.net to find what we've had to say about Blake as well. Finally, at 3b, how are we going to own a passage like this? Well, I think, it's easy to ask, what was a time in your life when you prayed, help me, or help others? And what was a time in your life when you prayed, thank you for yourself or for others? And is it altogether possible that if you look deep enough, you'll see that the moment was the same moment? I think Gibran would say, that makes sense. And from prayer, next we'll go to pleasure. Hurrah.